Have you ever stopped to think about why the laws in one country are so different from another? It's not just about what the laws actually say, it's about the entire system they're built on. Now, if you're studying for a professional paper, like the one for ACCA, getting a solid grip on these foundations is frankly non-negotiable. So in this explainer, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to build that foundation, giving you the core concepts you absolutely need to master. Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with the big picture, the whole political and economic environment that actually shapes the law. Then we'll dive into the three core systems and the super important principle of separation of powers. We'll even put the US and the UK side by side to see how they do things differently. And finally, we'll get into the real nitty-gritty of the three branches of government. It's all about starting broad and then zooming in so you can see how all these pieces perfectly fit together. So, first things first, let's nail down this core idea, political economy. I know, it might sound a little academic, but the concept is actually pretty straightforward. You just can't look at a country's laws in a vacuum. It doesn't work. They are completely tangled up with its politics and its economy, and each part is constantly pushing and pulling on the others.
Right. This definition right here is the bedrock for everything else we're going to talk about. And the crucial takeaway for your studies is this. You just cannot understand a country's laws by themselves. You have to understand the political and economic world they live in. They're all different pieces of the exact same puzzle.
Okay, so let's break down the three big pillars that hold up that political economy. We'll kick things off with the economic system, which really is all about how a society organizes itself and, pays the bills.
On the economic side of things, it pretty much boils down to two theoretical extremes. On one hand, you have a planned economy. Here, the government is the one calling all the shots. What gets produced, how much it costs, the whole shebang. It's very top-down. On the other hand, you have a market economy, which is the total opposite. Decisions are left up to regular people, buyers and sellers, through supply and demand. The key difference is simply who's in the driver's seat.
And this is a really crucial point to remember for any exam. These pure economies are really just ideas on paper. In the real world, pretty much every single country has a mixed economy. The real difference between nations isn't if they mix the two, but how much they mix them. The whole debate is always about finding that sweet spot on the spectrum between government control and market freedom.
All right, next up, the political system, how a country is actually managed. And the difference here is, well, it's stark. A dictatorship piles all the power into the hands of one person or a tiny group, with a really tight grip on individual freedom. A democracy, though, spreads that power out to the people through elected representatives. And that choice has massive consequences for the legal system because it determines who makes the laws and just how much freedom people have under them.
And that brings us to the legal system itself. Now, there are lots of variations, but we can pretty much group them into three main categories. You've got common law, which you'll find in places like the UK and the US, and it's built on judges' decisions from past cases. Then there's civil law, which is big in Europe, and it's all about detailed written legal codes that judges follow. And finally, Sharia law, which is based on Islamic religious principles. Each of these systems has a fundamentally different way of making and interpreting law.
So now that we've got the core systems down, let's talk about a critical principle that keeps them organized, the separation of powers. And this isn't just about making things run smoothly. Its main job is to stop any one part of the government from becoming way too powerful.
This quote right here, it just hits the nail on the head. It gets to the very heart of why separating powers is so important. The fear, the historical fear, is that if you let the same people make the laws, enforce the laws, and interpret the laws, well, you're basically creating a recipe for tyranny. It's a defense mechanism, plain and simple, born from some pretty tough lessons in history.
So what's the solution to that fear? You split the functions of government into three distinct branches. You have the legislature, which makes the law. You have the executive, which carries out the law, and you have the judiciary, which interprets the law. Now, it sounds simple on paper, but as you're about to see, how these branches actually interact is where things get really interesting.
So how does this all play out in the real world? Well, let's compare two major common law systems that have taken very different approaches, the United States and the United Kingdom.
Looking at this comparison, you can see a fundamental philosophical split. The U.S., with its formal written constitution, went for a very strict separation of powers. The president, who is the executive, absolutely cannot be a member of Congress, the legislature. But the U.K., with its unwritten constitution, has something called the Westminster model. And here, the executive and legislative branches are actually fused together. The prime minister and their cabinet are chosen from the legislature. And the whole idea is to make the government directly accountable to parliament. Two very different ways of doing things.
All right, let's zoom in and get into the weeds of what each branch actually does. For your law paper, you really need to know these details inside and out. So let's break it down.
First on the list is the legislature. These are the folks responsible for creating the laws of the land. Okay, now this is a key distinction. A legislature's power isn't always unlimited. In the UK, for example, Parliament is considered sovereign. What that means, in theory, is that it can pass any law it wants and the courts can't strike it down. But in a system with a subordinate legislature, like the US Congress, it's limited by a written constitution. So if Congress passes a law that violates that constitution, the Supreme Court can say, nope, that's unconstitutional and get rid of it. That is a massive difference in power.
Okay, next up is the executive branch. This is the part of government that actually puts all those laws into effect.
You can think of the executive as the engine of the state. It's the government itself, the civil service, the police, everybody who carries out the law day to day. And as we saw with the UK's Westminster model, the executive is chosen from the legislature. This leads to something called the doctrine of mandate. The idea is that the political party that wins an election has been given a mandate, basically permission, from the voters to turn their campaign promises into actual law. It's a really powerful justification for their agenda.
And finally, we arrive at the judiciary. This is the branch that interprets the law, settles legal fights, and decides how the law should be applied in real-world situations. Now, the judiciary's role isn't the same everywhere. In common law systems like the US and UK, judges are incredibly powerful. They don't just apply the law, they interpret it, and in doing so, they create precedents that actually become part of the law. In civil law systems, their job is more about applying very detailed legal codes. But in many systems, the judiciary holds a very powerful trump card to keep the other branches in line: judicial review.
Okay, this is a concept you absolutely have to nail down. Judicial review is not an appeal. The court isn't there to decide if a government agency made a good or bad decision. It only asks one question: did that agency act lawfully and within the power it was given? If it stayed within its powers, it acted intra vires. If it went beyond them, it acted ultra vires. So the court is basically like a referee, checking if the government played by the rules, not whether it won the game.